are, okay, we really didn't put the bearing retainer in the right place. And when you had severe torque loads from the ring and pinion, if you want to call it that, really it's the intermediate shaft ring gear, it would really deflect that case because the ring gear was trying to climb the intermediate shaft or vice versa, and we had case deflection. And it would torsionally distort the 525 case.
The 520 won't do this.
Right.
We've already tested that.
Now, Mopar Performance came out, Jerry Maldencote and I sat down way back when, and we came up with this thing. Support plate. That goes onto the left side of the differential housing. It's a rolled piece of channel, okay? And it has an 90-degree bend, but it has an inboard radius. It's not 90 degrees, it's 90 degrees in configuration, but it's got a radius in there, okay? That sits up against the bearing retainer. Stack of transmission, left drive shaft goes into it like this. This is your differential cover that sits on the back like that. When this thing went to packaging, we got a greater amount of strength out of rolling it than we did by 90-degree welding it or stamping it out. Okay, you got a roll radius, greater strength, 90-degree sharp stamping. And whenever you have a sharp stamping, you can set up stress risers or whatever. But this thing originally had a very sharp 90-degree corner. And what happens if you try to put this reinforcement up against that 90-degree corner? They don't fit. And what you get is a condition called a wink. And that's where one hole doesn't quite fit over the other hole, and that's called a wink. And you try to put a bolt down through that, and what are you going to do? You're going down through two pieces of steel into soft aluminum with a wink. Guess what you're going to strip out? Threads on the tranny. Plus the bolts that they supplied to you were some shit out of somebody's box that weren't even long enough to support this stuff. So this whole package that they sent you with no instructions, in 99% of the instances has been done wrong. Because they didn't tell you that you got a radius off that corner so that it fits the radius of this corner. Okay.
Now, does it have to fit flat?
Yes.
I mean, no, the edge. Does the edge have to actually butt up against
No, you just got to get it to where you don't have a wink condition. Okay? And then you got to go by the bolt pile. Oh, this goes on there. You got to go by the bolt pile, and you got to get a correspondingly thicker bolt. Somebody's out there looking for you. Somebody's here. Who's here? Who might you guys be? Huh? Is this more Californians?
Garcia.
Oh, Rich Garcia. Hi, how you doing? What are you doing? Craig.
Morning. That's what's kind of sitting back.
Craig.
I didn't mean to interrupt everybody.
Yeah, they got name tags over there. Throw their name in. Rich? Oh, yeah. Rich Garcia. Rich Garcia.
I gave Rich
Yeah. Anyway, when you mount this thing on, what you got to look at, you got to radius this thing off enough. What I mean by radius, you got to round it off enough where it fits the radius of this. Otherwise, you know, you got to look at it, use your damn eyes to make sure that you don't have a wink condition. Now you know what a wink is, okay? And then go get you a longer bolt. That's probably an easy 100,000ths longer, and get you a longer bolt that will, you know, still take the same amount of thread engagement, so you got the same amount of torque loading into the case of the transmission. Okay? If you're running a 525, this will increase the strength of the transmission about 18%. That's pretty damn good.
That's the reason when you get in the second gear, it crunches on.
That and the dog bone is letting the transmission swing backwards. Let the whole assembly swing backwards and it's lining up your linkage. Okay, we're going to talk about that in a minute. Okay. Now, the next thing that they don't tell you is that the rear cover, to make it strong, has got a flange stamped all the way around its perimeter. And to make this thing fit, you got to cut that flange off. You can't set this brace over the top of that flange. How the hell is it going to seal? Okay? There's not an instruction out there that says that it's got to fit flat, okay? So when the guys put it on, it didn't hold the back case tight, and all the transmission fluid leaks out. Now they got a shell transmission. They say, God damn junk sealers that Chrysler uses, you know? Because this thing wasn't explained to the novices enough to be able to stick it on.
What cars have the 525?
Anything that was made from 1984 to 1987.
Okay, so an 88 would be a 520.
88 would be a 520 or a 555.
And you're referring to L bodies, aren't you, then?
L bodies, every L body had a 525, no matter when it was built.
Because like the 87 Lancer is a
87
520.
Lancer could
It's
still
a
have
5.
either one. Most likely it's got an A520.
All the
or
Shelby's
550.
I've seen had 520s.
Daytona's 520.
Daytona's would be what year?
87.
That could be either one. They got a mixture in there. They were some of them 525, some of them A520s. Now, what do we do to correct this? We moved this bearing retainer. See how deep it sits right there?
To the outside.
To the inside.
Oh, inside.
Hold this. This is against the transmission. This is the drive shaft coming out, okay? The bearing is actually, the thickness of this, what's that, 3 inches? And it sits right underneath the ring gear. And when the ring gear is trying to, or the intermediate shaft is trying to climb the ring gear, it's putting all the bearing load right here on top of this retainer with this flimsy ass tin plate for the back of the transmission case. So, what we did is we moved this bearing out to the very edge. We brought it 3 inches further outboard, so now we got the baseball stance. Now we got a little bit better stability of that ring gear trying to climb the intermediate shaft. And it reduced the case deflection because we incorporated the whole back side of the case into a big aluminum pump gun. Gave us a whole lot more strength, okay? But those first transmissions were still 525 guts on the inside. All the cases are the same. Rich and I talked about it on the phone the other day. He says, I thought the cases were forged or some type of different material. They're all the same. Yes, he's right. In transmission guts, they changed in 1987 with the Turbo 2 Daytonas and the Turbo 2 Daytonas only, and they went to the Git-Track gears. Much coarser cut teeth. This is the intermediate shaft of the pinion that I was talking about. And they went to a much coarser tooth, and they went back to the old wide ratio again, like the A460, 465. If you ever drive a 525 in fourth gear, you've got a 1.04 ratio, which is an underdrive. And that engine is just racing like hell at about 50 miles an hour. If you throw a 555 in it, okay, it's a 0.94 fourth gear overdrive. Okay? And it's a much more comfortable, if you've got a much wider gear ratio spacing in there. Not as good for really racing, but better for the street. Okay? Now, remember the old Roman aqueducts? How we supplied water to the Romans? Everybody had these little aqueduct trays coming down from the mountains, you know, off the streams and the mountains and shit. Little bitty troughs and trays coming down. That's kind of how this transmission lubricates itself. This is a separator plate that's on the back side of the case. And the gears themselves actually splash up lubricant, throw it in this little trough right here. The oil flows so hopefully downhill, okay? Goes into the fifth gear cover, and then it goes into a fifth gear cover where it goes into the inside of this hollow intermediate shaft, or pinion. Okay?
Why don't we click our heels against?
Well, the big bad problem was that he had any oil leaks in the transmission, okay? And we filled these things with automatic transmission fluid for the sole purpose of when they were shipped to Yankee Land, they could shift them, and where Kenny lives, they could shift them when it was below zero. Because how are we going to know on the assembly line? Now, we couldn't put the damn thimble in there for the right oiling. We couldn't put the silent shafts on the engines correct. How are we going to know that this one's going to Texas and this one's going to New York? That maybe one should have a different lubricant in it than another. Because even though the transmission fluid was basically only 5 weight, because that's what automatic transmission fluid is about 5 weight, okay? It doesn't have as good a load carrying ability as engine oil, okay? But they put automatic transmission fluid in it to make it shift with better ease when it was cold. but automatic transmission fluid will degrade much quicker under shear loading. It doesn't have the load carrying abilities that motor oil has or a hypoid type gear oil. Okay? When you have a failure of one of these early transmissions, you'll probably see it in that type of Brunelling. That's what I call a Brunel. See that? This has a set of roller bearings that go into the case. And this is the common denominator failure on a lot of the 525 A555s. Mostly the A555s because they got a slight leak. They run a little bit low on oil. Where's the case at? The oil can't get up into the trough that John's holding up right there. The oil doesn't go down through this main shaft. And this is what supplies the oil to the front bearing. It's got to go all the way through here, feed all these damn gears, and it winds up galding this front race. Okay? Now, 568s, we corrected this to some degree. Can we do that again? To some degree. Okay? We put a sleeve over the top of this and increased its diameter by about 200 thousandths. So we put a 100 thousandths thick sleeve on it. So we increased the load carrying ability and increased the square inch coverage of bearing. Okay? That improved it to some degree, but the biggest improvement we did, we took the automatic transmission fluid out and we put in 5W30 motor oil. Okay? One addition that you can do to your own transmission, go get you some mobile 0W30 and put that in your transmission. Okay, now one thing you got to do is you got to put a drain plug in. Remember looking underneath your transmission, and right about underneath where the ring gear would be, whether it be a 525, an A525, 55, there should be a drain plug there. There's a little square boss with a little hole right in the center that doesn't go into the case. You say, what the hell is that? It looks like a skid plate. Well, it kind of is, but that's the fixture holding device when new process machines that transmission case. That's all it is, a fixture holding device. But we can use that, and if you got it up on a lift, just drill through. If you don't have a whole lot of pressure with the drill bit, you bounce off the ring gear a little bit, it's going to hurt. You're not going to hurt your ring gear's hard. And just go through it and put a small drill through it first, and then get back and let it drain. And then pull the drain plug off, okay? And then go back and drill it out all the way, and put the drain plug off. Go get yourself a funnel and a couple gallons of kerosene and wash out the transmission, any little remaining machine particles that might be there. And then go back in and tap it, okay, with a 3/8 pipe tap. Go back in and wash it out one more time, turn the gears over, wash it out, all this shit out on the inside, get all the impurities out of it, and then go back in with some 10W30 and one. You got yourself a pretty bulletproof transmission.
030, did you say?
0W30.
I have a question. That shaft you're holding on one of the transmissions I worked on had like a little oil bath or plastic or something inside there to keep the oil from going down that shaft as fast.
Some of these had a restrictive washer in them.
Yeah.
Okay? Most of them don't. Remember I said the thimble? Restricted oil to the head? Some of these also had a washer that was stomped into the end of this thing. And that's about a 10mm hole, and it too was restricted to about 125,000, maybe 200,000.
So it should or should not be in there? Doesn't matter?
I don't think in this instance, if you got enough fluid in the transmission, you got the right fill in there, you got to worry about this. I'd want as much oil going in this particular bearing as you can. Okay?
So technically, wouldn't it be better to actually overfill your train?
Yes, we're going to get into that right now. What we're going to do is when you fill the transmission, you're going to have a problem by doing this, okay? On this, give me that housing. Pass that back up to me. That happens to be off of a 568, which is a little bit different than a 520 or 525. The vent on this particular transmission is in the shift cover. But on all 525, A525, 55s, there's a little vent right here. Grab a hold of that with a pair of pliers. And it'll come pull right up. And you'll find that it's 1/8 pipe down in there. So go get you a 1/8 by 1/4 inch brass nipple and just thread it in. And you've got a 1/4 inch nipple sticking out for a 1/4 inch hose. Get you about 2 foot of rubber hose, run it up behind the battery and just loop it over and tie it down with tie strap. Jack up the transmission with the tires about that far off the ground, about a foot, okay?
Low side of the car.
About like you had yours last night.
Yeah, on the driver's side.
Pull the drain plug out and fill it until the fluid runs out. And you'll be about another half a quart over full. If you do that with the stock vent, it's going to foam and all the oil is going to come out and go all over the side of the car. But if you do it with the nipple that I showed you how to do, with a foot piece of hose, it works great. Now if you live in a real extremely wet area where you get a lot of rain, and you're worried about ingression back there from moisture, what you got to do is go buy a 4x4 one-way vent hose where it only flows, it only vents itself one way. Nothing can get in, but it can vent back out, just like on a differential for a 4x4. Okay? Now, one problem with the 555. Why my pants keep falling off? Am I hungry? What time is it, Texas? Huh? What time is it, Texas? About 4 o'clock. God damn, I wish. You guys eat White Castle hamburgers? They have those over here. In 1989, they made a change in this 555 transmission. And they felt that we can improve the shift effort because the magazine's reading us up again on the shift effort between first and second back to first. That was the greatest amount of torque loading on those gears.
I drove a German car, hasn't it?
Well, they like to beat up people. And anyway, they changed and they went to a fiberite synchronizer on first and second. Okay, got a fiberite in, so it's a whole different ballgame when you look at one of these moments. 89 up, whether it be a 555, 568, 523, late 568, whatever, it's going to have a fiberite synchronizer and the intermediate shaft, first and second gear, and the synchronizer is all different on those transmissions. Guess what? If an early 555 disintegrates from Brunelli, I want to go in and buy this part off an 87 555. NS1. What's NS1? No longer serviced. You've got to buy a kit which upgrades this thing to an 89. You've got to buy the intermediate shaft. You've got to buy first gear, second gear, and synchronizer. Guess what that cost? About $750 Dieter cost. So when you guys buy an 87, an 88, or even possibly, no, it won't be in the 89s, but it'll be an 87 or 88, 555. You better take it apart and look at this race machined on the front of the intermediate shaft. Okay? Because if you bought that, right there, that's Brunelli. Okay? You know what I'm talking about. Okay? That's Brunelli. You got yourself an eminent failure because that thing is surface fatigued from either lack of lubricant or just sheer load factor. Okay, that's Brunelli.
Is there anything you can do to them prior to that happening?
I have not been able to fix this. There is a character down in Florida who claims that he can build a sleeve for this, like they do kind of on the 568s. They do have a sleeve that goes over this thing. I can't find the sleeve. I am going to investigate putting this thing, you know, it's chuckable, and like they weld up a crankshaft, see if this can be welded up and machined back down. I'm going to see if that can be done. Yeah, I'm going to look at that and see if we can do it.
I bought a shaft for 525 that they put a sleeve on. It's sheer right
Yeah.
now.
This
1 week.
This here is, it could be a metallurgical problem. It could be insufficient heat treat, overheat treat, lack of lubrosity, simply not a big enough diameter of surface load, okay, with enough square inch of surface area on the bearing. There might be a combination of all the above. That particular failure. That's why on the 568s, they increased the diameter of this by 200 thousandths. And they too, on the 568s, overfill them a little bit. Instead of putting 2.5 quarts in, they put about 2 2/3 quarts in. Okay. Anything else? Whoop, whoop, whoop. John, you asked the question. And I failed to answer you. Shift levers. Whether it be 460, a 465, an A520, 525, they differ a little bit, okay? This is what puts it into first or second, third or fourth, or reverse. This is what puts it into the quadrant of a quadrant. Puts it in the first or second quadrant, the third or fourth quadrant, or reverse quadrant, okay? This physically puts it in first, or physically puts it in second. We're not interested in this fulcrum point, but I'm interested in that fulcrum point, because this puts it in first, or second, or third, or fourth. If I can shorten that throw ever so much, I have shortened the throw better than an inch on each side of the gear shift lever. How would you like to have a gear shift lever that you could shorten an inch on each side? Huh?
What about effort? Does it go up that much?
Negligible
Really?
with the automatic or by one. If you try to drill through this with any kind of drill bits that you got, forget it. Number one, the first thing you got to do is sit down and weld. And you better have yourself. I don't know what I got AJ Foyt's machinist that works for me. He cursed me in Texas talk for about 10 minutes one time, because I asked him to do this, and he said he had to go down and buy special drill bits. And he probably did. Anyway, you don't even have to re-drill the other hole, or you don't even have to weld it up if you don't want to. You just go up as far as you can on the radius. Make sure a nut will fit behind it. And if you can find yourself some kind of a drill bit, or send it to me, and I'll have HL do it for you. And, but that's the way you change the shift length, about an inch on each side.
I want one.
Oh, make a bunch.
Did you ever get yours running?
I got my parts.
They haven't got there.
Last night I just got them.
At UP, isn't that ridiculous? This has been done to yours.
Yeah. Doesn't that reduce the leverage though?
It might increase the leverage slightly, okay? I mean, it increases some resistance because you don't have as much of a, fulcrum there. Yeah, that's something you got to feel out, yourself. Pass it around, test it. While we're in the transmissions, I know everybody's getting tired, and I need a little bit of a break now. Let me just cover one more thing. That's torque loading of the whole powertrain, where the powertrain tries to swing rearward due to the rotation of the motor. That's really a problem on an L-body car, where you got the dog bone back there. You got rubber biscuits on both sides, and where you got linkage for shift linkage. Don't have cables. And the drive shafts are trying to do this. So you're downloading them. Your shift linkages, the ball sockets are trying to pull apart. And that's a real problem. A couple things you got to do to correct that if you're going to look at performance. Take your motor mounts off, and if you can find this, go by a window installation shop. See if you can find, remember they used to put windows in with butyl, and then they switched over to urethane? Butyl was first used in about 1984 on the first 84 Dodge Daytona. We put all the windows in with that. And the windows actually became part of the structural entity of the body. I mean, it actually increased. If I took all the windows out of a Daytona and put it on a twist fixture, it'd twist all over hell. But with the windows in it, it added structural strength to the body. But it didn't add enough. And there were some pop-out concerns that the federal government had, and they made us go back to use urethane. And urethane gets very hard. But if you can find some butyl that doesn't get hard, that's an excellent filler for the voids in your mounts. Whether it be the front mount underneath the radiator, whether it be the horse head mount over on the passenger side, or whether it be the transmission mount. You got to get something that's that stays a little bit flexible.
I know. No, it's like a.
One thing you got to do if these mounts have been in service, you got to clean them real good with some kind of a chlorinated cleaner. Get in there with a rag and clean them out on the inside so there's no grease and residue in it. And you got to do this over a period of time. You can't just scoop and fill these things up, or they're not going to sit there and cure. You got to do it in about 4 nights. So you got to fill it up about a third, let it cure. Fill it up the next night a third, let it cure. The next night and let it cure. The last thing I would use would probably be RTV, silicone. But it does work. Okay? It does work. It adds a tremendous amount of resiliency to the mounts. What's the mount that I buy from Mopar Performance? It's another reject. It's a mount that was rejected because of its durometer hardness. We measure rubber hardnesses by its durometer. And those are made up in Canada. And when the Chrysler purchase people went up to look at them, they're too hard. They're going to transmit too much resonance back into the body. So those were early rejected mounts. Who bought them up? Well, Parker Furnace. And they do work to some degree, because they're a little bit harder mounts. But they still collapse. Now, the next thing you got to do is you got to sit down and you got to put in some type of restraining device, and I've seen everything from chains to there are all kinds of medieval torture devices that are hanging off the motor. This one happens to be a piece that I designed that goes onto an A520. This is adjustable, so you can sit there, and I purposely make these things. I take off the shock absorber. The A520, 555, 568, it's got a shock back here. Okay, useless. The 525 has got a dog motor. Okay? So I use what is basically a dog motor. And I weld a chrome moly sleeve on it, put in a 1/2-inch shaft. You break the nut loose right here, and I can take this shaft up and down, but when I send it to you, it comes purposely 13 millimeters longer. So it makes the engine stand up a little bit more upright. And what that does is that brings the drive shafts back up to their proper angularity. And now it can't twist rearward because this thing is holding it in position because it doesn't give. So all that energy that you had that was displacing the engine, displacing the drive shafts, and sometimes blowing them apart or popping your gear shift linkages off, okay? Now it's being transmitted to the road wheels, and you're whipping that 5.0 Mustang's ass. Okay. This is the design for an A520, 568 automatic transmission, or automatic transmission, because they have nothing on them. Now, if you got an automatic and you're converting over, this is not on the cross member. Right here. You guys' wives. Mothers or something. Anyway, if you got an automatic, you'll not find this thing welded to the cross member. You may possibly still find this particular piece. You want to write it down or etch it in your gray matter. 4323000. It's supposedly going in S1, but you may find it, and if you ask a dealer to go back and do a part search for you, 4323000. Or you're going to have to go out to the boneyard, and you're going to have to cut one of these off and use that in place of this. Okay? Now, the 525 mount is similar to this, but I sold them all out before I came. Sorry, I don't have a sample to show you. But it is basically similar to this, and it's not adjustable. Okay, there's not enough room back there to do the adjustability.
Does it preload?
You can, there's slots in those. There's got no mirrors back there though.
There's some slot in it right there, but I get it to where when I'm 13 millimeters, about a 1/2 inch, okay? I get it where this thing is really jammed in there, and it's really shoving the engine up. I mean, it's in there in a bind. That's why I want it. The automatic is a real tough one. I just finished designing this before I came, and I haven't even really, mocked. This is just a mock-up that I'm using right here. This is the back cover of the automatic. This is a piece that I welded up to mount, because there's not even a dog going for one of them. And I got a lot of guys with 300 horsepower plus automatics, plus the car I'm building, okay? And I wanted a torque control device, so this is a piece I just mocked up, and that's the first one I built. So anyway, I'll have some automatics available pretty soon. The one thing that happens when the engine does torque rearward is that it drops the drive shafts. And if you don't have the engine centered, what it has a tendency to do on the inner CV joint is pull it out. And if you were at Topeka, when the kid from Florida lost his drive shaft on the assembly line, on the drag strip, what he did was he was doing a massive launch, trying to impress us all, and the engine torqued rearward. Of course, the drivetrain came up in the air, the suspension arced down, and it just literally pulled the drive shaft out of the transmission. That is the inboard tripod in a standard Turbo 1 all the way up to automatic transmission to 90 in the L body. That is the tripod out of a Turbo 2 Daytona, LeBaron, or whatever. Look at the difference in physical strength of those two. Okay? Now, everybody asks me, all right, can I take the 525 out of my L body and put an A520, 568 in? Rich Garcia's doing that right now. Okay? But the problem you run into is you can't interchange axles, because we moved the axle on the left side outboard by 3 inches, whatever I did with that particular part.
It's floating.
Oh, it's floating? Okay. So we need a shorter axle to the driver's side. Plus, we went up to much bigger splines that go into the transmission, into the spider gears. You can see the difference.